The day they laughed at him. The air in the break room felt colder than usual. Not because the heater was broken, though in that factory, half the machines were always half dead, but because silence had fallen just before the laughter came. The kind of silence that makes your skin remember every bad day you've ever had. Bill Turner stood there with his lunchbox still in his hand, his thermos sweating a thin line of coffee down the side, while 20 pairs of eyes watched him as if he'd just said something outrageous. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't cursed. He'd only said quietly, "I don't think it's right to take away people's sick days." And that's when they laughed. The foreman, a big man with an even bigger ego, slapped his knee. "You think you decide what's right here, Turner." The others followed. Some laughed because they wanted to. Most laughed because they were afraid not to. Bill didn't laugh. He just nodded like a man who'd been disappointed enough times to know what disappointment sounded like. He was 53, a small man with rough hands and a soft voice. The kind of man who still held doors open, who still said sir and ma'am, even when no one did anymore. He'd worked at the plant for 27 years, long enough to watch the paint peel, the pensions vanish, and the good men disappear one by one. For 27 years, Bill Turner believed if you worked hard, you'd be treated fair. That morning he learned hard work had nothing to do with fairness. The meeting ended. The laughter lingered. Bill walked back to his station, a narrow corner by the press line where the sound of metal filled every thought. He liked the noise, it hid the world. But today it couldn't hide the echo of that laughter. He set his lunch down beside the machine, opened the lid, and stared at the sandwich his wife had made that morning. Peanut butter and jelly, crust cut off just like always. She still thought small kindnesses could protect a man. She didn't know the world had stopped caring about kindness a long time ago. At lunch he sat alone. No one joined him. They didn't mean to be cruel, they were just afraid to stand too close to the man who spoke up. In places like this, silence was safety, and Bill Turner had just broken that rule. He remembered something his father used to say. "Sometimes, son, you've got to let them laugh. That's how you know you scared them." But it didn't feel like courage. It felt like standing in the rain with no roof to run under. Later that day, while everyone was clocking out, the foreman stopped him by the door. "Word of advice, Turner," he said, voice low. "You keep stirring people up, you'll find yourself out of a job." He smiled, that half-smile bullies have when they think they've already won. Bill met his eyes, steady and tired. "I'm not stirring anything," he said. "I'm just tired of watching good men lose everything they worked for." The foreman snorted. "You're no hero, Turner. You're just another old guy afraid of change." Maybe he was right. Maybe Bill was afraid of change, but not the kind the foreman meant. He was afraid of a world where men didn't care about one another anymore, where a paycheck meant more than a promise, where laughter, cruel, empty laughter, replaced decency. That night at home, he didn't tell his wife what had happened. She asked how his day was, and he said, "Just another Monday." She smiled, poured him a cup of coffee, and told him their son had called, talking about a job promotion, about moving to another city. He listened, nodded, pretended the world wasn't cracking a little under his feet. After dinner, he went to the porch. The town lights blinked in the distance like tired stars. He could still hear the echo of laughter in his head, but beneath it something else began to stir, a quiet, stubborn ache that said, "This isn't how it's supposed to be." He thought about the men who'd lost their jobs last winter, about the woman who'd worked 20 years and got nothing when the plant restructured, about his father who died believing the world rewarded decency, and about his son growing up in a world that didn't. Somewhere between the hum of the streetlights and the sound of his own heartbeat, Bill Turner made a decision he didn't fully understand yet. He would speak again. Not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but soon, because someone had to. Someone had to remind them what fairness used to mean. Someone had to remind them that laughter, when it comes at another man's pain, isn't laughter at all. In that small house on that ordinary night, a small man made a quiet promise to himself. And in the years to come, people would say the movement started with a protest, or a petition, or a headline. But those who were there, the ones who remembered the day they laughed, would tell it differently. They'd say it started with a man in a factory, holding a lunchbox, who decided that being silent hurt worse than being laughed at. Would you have spoken up that day, or would you have kept your head down, pretending not to hear the laughter? Because every movement, every wave of change, starts with someone who decides that quiet is no longer enough. The next morning, the town woke to the hum of factory buses and the gray breath of dawn settling over the rooftops. Bill Turner was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, tying his worn leather boots with fingers that moved slow and careful, the way a man ties the same laces he's tied for decades. The kitchen smelled of toasted bread and the faint sweetness of his wife's lavender detergent. She hummed a gospel tune softly as she packed his lunch. The radio whispered the local news, the same loop of weather and traffic. Everything was ordinary, almost painfully so. Bill liked ordinary. He'd built his life around it, the steady rhythm of work, dinner, bed. He didn't crave attention, didn't seek conflict. He was, by all accounts, a man who never complained. But silence, too, can grow heavy over the years, like dust gathering in corners you've stopped noticing. At the plant, the morning light crept through the high windows, turning the air into a haze of gold and smoke. The sound of machines starting up was almost musical, a chorus of clanks and whirs and low groans that filled every inch of the old building. Bill clocked in, nodded to a few faces that pretended not to see him, and took his place at the press line. The steel was cold beneath his hands. He knew every sound that machine made, the sharp hiss before the press came down, the small pop of air that meant the pressure was right. He'd been there long enough to know when something was about to break. And not just the machine. A faint smell of oil hung in the air, mixing with the bitter scent of burnt metal. Sweat and metal, that was the perfume of this place. He used to joke about it years ago when the men still laughed with him instead of at him. He thought of old friends, Mike, who'd retired after his back gave out. Eddie, who'd lost his job when the company restructured. Men who'd given their lives to this floor and left with nothing more than a thank you email and a cardboard box. Bill had seen it all. He'd seen how a man's loyalty could be turned into his leash. How good workers were told to take one for the team until there was nothing left of them to take. And through it all he'd stayed quiet, because that's what good men did, until yesterday. He worked through the morning, the rhythm of the press pulling him back into its trance. Every strike of metal felt like a heartbeat, steady, relentless, echoing through the concrete walls. He caught glimpses of the foreman walking by, whispering to supervisors, sometimes glancing his way. But he didn't flinch. He just kept working, because this was what he knew to keep going, even when your name turned to rumor, even when laughter followed you down the hall like an invisible tail. At lunch, he sat on a bench behind the factory, where the air was cleaner and the world felt a little bigger. The wind carried the smell of cut grass from a nearby field. A train whistle moaned in the distance, low, mournful, like a memory that never learned how to fade. He ate slowly, each bite measured, his thoughts wandering. He thought about the first day he'd walked into this place. He'd been 26, nervous but proud. The manager back then had looked him in the eye and said, "We take care of our own here." Bill had believed that. He'd believed it through 3 recessions, 2 buyouts, and the day the pensions disappeared. Now he wasn't so sure who our own meant anymore. When he got home that night, the house greeted him with warmth, a soft lamp glow spilling across the living room carpet, the smell of stew simmering on the stove. His wife, Marlene, was folding laundry on the couch. She looked up, smiled. "You're quiet tonight," she said. He shrugged, took off his boots by the door. "Just tired." But the truth sat somewhere deeper, a small knot in his chest that wouldn't loosen. After dinner, he went outside again onto the porch. The wood creaked under his weight, familiar and forgiving. The neighborhood was calm. The crickets had started their nightly song, that endless rhythm of life carrying on, no matter what men worried about. He remembered his father's hands, big, cracked, stained with grease. He used to come home the same way, quiet and worn, with a kind of dignity that didn't need words. Bill used to think his father never complained because he was strong. Now he wondered if it was because no one ever listened. He sat there a long time, staring at the streetlight flickering down the road. In the distance, the factory stood like a shadow against the sky, a giant that fed and swallowed families all the same. He knew tomorrow would be harder, the stares sharper, the whispers louder. But there was something new inside him now, something small but steady, a pulse that refused to die down. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was awareness, the kind that creeps in when a man realizes he spent his whole life being grateful for less than he deserved. He ran a thumb along the edge of his calloused palm. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of everything those hands had built, the roofs, the meals, the life he'd quietly held together. and he thought maybe not tonight, but soon he'd have to use them for something more. The wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of machines from across town, the sound of work that never stopped, no matter how many lives it wore down. He listened for a long time, eyes half closed, as if he could already hear the crack in that rhythm, the small beginning of something that wouldn't stay silent much longer. By Thursday morning, a thin mist hung over the parking lot, the kind that clings to the metal roofs and smells faintly of rain and smoke. Bill Turner parked his old Ford pickup in the same spot he'd used for 20 years, the one near the cracked lamppost that never worked right. The sky above the factory was pale, washed out, as if even the sun didn't want to show up for work anymore. He could tell something was off before he even walked inside. People stood in small clusters near the time clock, whispering, their voices low and sharp. The bulletin board was crowded, a new memo pinned in the center, printed in bold red letters. Effective immediately, revised employment policy attendance, overtime and sick leave. A chill ran through the room. Someone muttered, they can't do this. Someone else said they already did. Bill moved closer, reading the sheet line by line. By the second paragraph, his stomach tightened. The company had cut paid sick days from 10 to 3. Anyone missing more than that would lose seniority credit and risk termination. Overtime pay was replaced by flex hours, meaning unpaid time could be adjusted later. And most insulting of all, workers were required to sign an acknowledgement that they accepted the new terms, or face suspension. The room felt smaller. He heard the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the buzz in the silence of people realizing they'd been cornered. Guess loyalty's just a word now, an older worker whispered beside him. Bill didn't answer. His throat had gone dry. He folded the paper once slowly and turned away. The foreman was waiting by the production floor, arms crossed. Everyone'll need to sign by end of shift, he announced. His tone was flat, rehearsed, the kind of voice that's been told exactly what to say and what not to feel. This isn't optional. Bill stared at him for a long second. 3 sick days, he said quietly. What happens if a man gets hurt or his kid ends up in the hospital? The foreman shrugged. That's not my problem, Turner. You want the policy changed, take it up with corporate. The words hung there, heavy and final. Bill turned toward his machine. The world felt oddly louder, clanging presses, the grinding belts, the squeal of forklifts. Each sound jabbed at his nerves like tiny needles. He tried to focus on the work, but the numbers on the control panel blurred. He thought of the men around him, the older ones with bad backs, the younger ones still believing this job could build a future. He thought of Marlene's voice that morning, telling him she'd made a doctor's appointment for her blood pressure. 3 sick days. 3. At break, he went outside. The air was crisp, sharp with the scent of wet pavement. A train rumbled somewhere behind the warehouses, its horn echoing across the river. He stood there alone, the folded policy still in his pocket. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if it carried all the small betrayals that had piled up over the years. Tom Haskins joined him, a guy from the next line over. Younger, broad-shouldered, still optimistic. Crazy, huh? Tom said, lighting a cigarette. They just keep taking more. Bill didn't smoke, but the smell of tobacco mixed with rain reminded him of his father, those quiet evenings when men talked about dignity like it was something you could still hold in your hands. They do it because we let them, Bill said. Tom looked surprised. You thinking of saying something again? Bill's jaw tightened. I'm thinking about right and wrong, that's all. The whistle blew, sharp and metallic. Break was over. Back inside. They lined up to sign. A table had been set near the office with a supervisor seated behind it. Each worker stepped forward, signed, and left without a word. The pen clicked, papers rustled. The line moved like a quiet surrender. When it was Bill's turn, he stared at the paper. His name printed neatly on the acknowledgement form. He could almost feel everyone's eyes behind him, the unspoken plea, *, don't make a scene, just sign it. He set the pen down. I'm not signing this. The supervisor blinked. Excuse me. I said I'm not signing something that says I agree to be treated worse than before. The foreman stepped forward. Turner, don't start this again, everyone's signing. Then maybe everyone's forgotten what they're worth, Bill said, voice steady but low. A few heads turned. The room grew still. The machines in the back hummed like distant thunder. The supervisor's smile was thin. You understand refusing to sign could be grounds for disciplinary action. Bill nodded. You understand loyalty works both ways. For a moment no one spoke. Then the foreman barked, "Get back to work, Turner, we'll deal with this later." Bill walked away, the paper unsigned. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from something deeper, something waking up. That night he sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, the policy sheet laid flat before him. The words glared under the lamp's yellow glow. Marlene had gone to bed. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock and the faint drip of the faucet. He read the policy again and again until the words blurred together. He thought of all the years he'd given, the missed birthdays, the backaches, the silence. And for the first time he wondered what any of it was worth. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the old oak tree by the porch. Its branches scraped against the siding like whispers. He looked up, eyes tired but alert. There's a point when patience stops being a virtue and starts being permission. That night Bill Turner realized he'd crossed it. He folded the paper, set it aside, and leaned back in his chair. The kitchen light flickered once before steadying. Somewhere in the distance the factory siren echoed, the same one that marked every shift change, every beginning and end. But tonight, it sounded different, like something had shifted, something that would not go back to sleep. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside a manila envelope that smelled faintly of toner and cold metal. It waited for him on the foreman's desk, no greeting, no smile, just a square of paper that would quietly change everything. Bill Turner had walked in expecting another long day of noise and routine, but the moment he saw his name printed across that envelope, his stomach tightened. He already knew. "Management wants a word," the foreman said, not looking up from his clipboard. Bill nodded and followed him into the small glass office that overlooked the production floor. The room felt too bright, too clean, fluorescent lights humming above, the air heavy with the scent of disinfectant and paper. A manager he barely knew sat behind the desk, his tie perfectly straight, his expression polite in the way a man's is when he's already made up his mind. "Mr. Turner," the manager began, sliding the letter across the table, "this is a formal notice regarding your refusal to comply with company policy." Bill looked at it but didn't touch it. The words "written warning" were bold at the top. He listened, not to what was being said, but to the sound of the presses outside, dull and rhythmic through the walls, a heartbeat that didn't belong to him anymore. "You understand this is simply procedural," the man continued. "No pay cuts, no suspension, not yet. We just need acknowledgement that you've received the warning." Bill met his eyes. "And if I don't?" The manager smiled faintly. "Then it becomes insubordination." The word hung in the air like smoke. Insubordination, a long, polished word that could erase 27 years in a single sentence. He picked up the letter. The paper was thin, almost translucent. His own name looked strange on it, foreign, as though it belonged to someone else. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Thank you," folded it once and walked out. The factory seemed quieter when he returned to his station, though the machine still roared. Tom Haskins looked over from the next line, mouthing, "You okay?" Bill gave a small nod. He slipped the letter into his lunchbox next to his sandwich and thermos. For a moment he thought about tossing it into the bin, but he couldn't. There was something about seeing your life reduced to a single sheet of paper that made you want to hold on, just to prove it was real. The rest of the day crawled. Every sound felt sharper, the metallic whine of conveyor belts, the hiss of air compressors, the chatter of voices that stopped when he walked by. He could feel the shift. The way people averted their eyes, their greetings turning into murmurs. By the time the final whistle blew, his head ached from the tension behind his temples. He walked out into the parking lot as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in burnt orange and gray. The smell of diesel hung in the air. Tom caught up with him near the fence. "They gave you one too?" Bill shook his head. "Just me." Tom swore under his breath. "That's messed up, you just spoke the truth." Bill half smiled. "Truth's got a funny way of getting you in trouble these days." They stood there for a moment, neither man speaking, the hum of the town carrying softly in the distance. Then Tom said, "They're trying to scare you, Bill." Bill looked at the letter still tucked in his hand. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe they're scared too." At home, Marlene was watering her geraniums on the windowsill when he walked in. She turned, drying her hands on a dish towel. "You're late." "Yeah," he said, setting his lunchbox on the counter. "Had to stop by the office." She studied his face. "Everything all right?" He hesitated long enough for her to notice. "What happened, Bill?" He didn't want to worry her. Didn't want to bring the factory's ugliness into their small, quiet kitchen. The words came out anyway. They gave me a warning letter. She frowned. For what? For not signing. She shook her head, eyes glistening. After all these years, he nodded, sitting down at the table. Guess years don't count for much anymore. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence between them. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street, sharp and distant. Marlene poured him a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly. You could just sign it, she whispered. Keep your head down, finish the year, maybe things will settle. Bill stared at the steam rising from the cup. It smelled faintly of chamomile, her way of calming storms. I've kept my head down too long, he said softly. If I sign, it means I agree they can take whatever they want. She didn't argue. She just sat beside him, their shoulders touching, the kind of quiet support that says more than words. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, he unfolded the letter again. The words were plain and cold. Failure to comply, disciplinary process, future violations may result in termination. He ran his thumb along the edge of the page. His hands were steady now. The fear had burned away, leaving something heavier, conviction. He slipped the letter back into the envelope and placed it in the drawer beside his father's old pocket knife and a faded photo of the factory crew from years ago. Men smiling, sleeves rolled, proud. Most of them were gone now. The wind outside rattled the window panes. A low hum from the highway drifted through the night air. He sat for a long time in the dim light, staring at nothing, until the shadows on the wall began to move like slow water. The paper in the drawer felt like more than a warning. It felt like a line being drawn. And for the first time in his life, Bill Turner was ready to decide which side he was on. It was the kind of cold that seeps through everything, through gloves, through denim, through the thin walls of a man trying to keep himself together. Winter had arrived early that year, and with it came silence, the uneasy kind that hangs around when people don't know what to say to you anymore. Since the warning letter, things at the factory had shifted. Not in a way you could point to. No one yelled, no one threatened, but the air had changed. Conversation stopped when Bill walked by. Breakroom laughter turned into low murmurs, and eyes that used to meet his now slid away like he wasn't there. He told himself it didn't matter. He'd always worked alone. But solitude feels different when it's chosen, not given to you like punishment. Tom Haskins was the one person who still talked to him. They'd shared a line for almost 10 years, traded lunches, covered each other's shifts. Tom was younger, mid-30s, strong, the kind of guy who still believed things could get better if you played them right. Management's nervous, Tom said one morning as they loaded steel sheets onto the press. I heard they're worried you'll get the union boys stirred up again. Bill gave a small laugh. Union boys, we haven't had one of those meetings in years. Still, Tom said, lowering his voice, you're on their radar. I'd be careful what you say around here. Bill nodded, wiping sweat from his neck despite the cold. The smell of oil and hot steel clung to everything. He could feel the heat of the press at his back, that constant hum of labor that seemed to drown out truth itself. I'm not trying to start trouble, Bill said quietly. Just trying to remind them we're human. Tom nodded, but his eyes darted toward the office windows above the floor. A few days later, Bill was called in again. Same glass office. Same sterile air. Only this time, there were two people waiting. The manager and a corporate rep he'd never seen before, a man with slicked hair, thin-framed glasses, and a smile so polite it hurt to look at. Mr. Turner, the rep began, folding his hands, we've received some concerning reports about your recent conduct. Bill frowned. What kind of reports? The man adjusted his tie. It seems you've been spreading misinformation about company policy, encouraging others to disregard management decisions. That's not true, Bill said, voice calm but tight. I told a friend what the new policy says, that's it. The manager slid a printed sheet across the desk. Then how do you explain this email? Bill stared down. There it was, a transcript of his conversation with Tom, written word for word. They do it because we let them. I'm thinking about right and wrong. That's all. The words looked harsh, printed in black ink. Stripped of tone, stripped of context, they read like rebellion. He felt the blood drain from his face. Where did you get this? The manager didn't answer. He didn't have to. Bill sat back, exhaling slowly. He could almost hear the sound of Tom's voice from that morning, the scrape of his lighter, the way his eyes kept glancing toward the office windows. It hit him then, quiet and sudden, not anger but something heavier. The the dull ache of understanding. By the time he left the office, his chest felt hollow. The machines on the floor roared louder than ever, but it all sounded far away. He walked past Tom without a word. "Bill," Tom called after him. Bill didn't turn. It wasn't until the end of the day that Tom found him in the locker room. The air smelled of soap and sweat, steam curling up from the showers in the back. "Bill, wait," Tom said. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." Bill closed his locker door slowly. "What did you think was gonna happen, Tom?" "They asked me what we talked about," Tom said, his voice shaking a little. "I didn't think it mattered. I didn't want to lie." Bill looked at him, not with anger but with something worse, disappointment that felt old, like it had been waiting there all along. "You didn't want to lie," he repeated softly, "but you didn't tell the truth either." Tom swallowed. "I'm sorry, Bill. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd write me up too. I've got kids, man." Bill nodded, staring at the floor. "Yeah, I get it." He grabbed his jacket, the fabric rough beneath his fingers. Tom's voice cracked behind him. "I'd have done the same." Bill turned then, eyes tired but steady. "No," he said quietly. "That's the thing, Tom, I wouldn't have." Outside, the cold hit like a slap. The sun was gone and the sky hung low, heavy, the color of iron. His breath came out in thin clouds that disappeared too quickly. The factory lights flickered behind him, a dull yellow against the darkening horizon. He walked across the lot alone, boots crunching on frost. Each step felt slower than the last. Somewhere inside, a part of him still wanted to forgive. He understood fear, the kind that makes a man protect what little he has left. But betrayal, even when it's dressed in reason, still cuts deep. When he reached his truck, he stopped. Through the windshield, he could see his reflection faintly, the lines on his face, the fatigue in his eyes, the man he'd quietly become. He gripped the steering wheel but didn't start the engine. The hum of the distant machines reached him even here, muffled but steady. He thought about how trust works, how it takes years to build and only one frightened moment to break. And for the first time since all this began, he felt something different than sadness or resolve. He felt alone. The kind of alone that makes you see the world not as it is, but as it's become. He sat there until the frost crept up the corners of the windshield, until the cold bit through his jacket, until the realization settled fully in. This wasn't just about a policy anymore. It was about people, and how easily they traded each other away when fear came knocking. The sky that morning was the color of tin, dull, cold, unfeeling. Bill Turner stood at his locker, tightening the laces of his boots with slow, deliberate pulls. The factory floor beyond the door hummed with its usual restlessness, but something in the air was different. You could sense it the way animals sense a coming storm. He felt the stares before he saw them, the kind that don't last long enough to confront, but linger just enough to burn. Even the sound of the time clock felt louder that morning, each click a reminder of how fragile everything had become. He hadn't spoken to Tom since that day in the locker room. There wasn't anything left to say. The trust between them had been folded and discarded like the paper that carried his warning. When the shift bell rang, Bill took his position at the press line. His hands moved on instinct, guiding the sheets of steel, aligning them, lowering the press. The motion was familiar, but the rhythm inside him was off. His chest felt heavy, his breath shorter than usual. Half an hour in, he saw the foreman coming. Two men followed behind, one from HR, the other a security guard whose uniform looked freshly pressed. They moved with a kind of practiced caution, like people who knew they were walking into a moment someone would remember for a long time. "Turner," the foreman called out over the noise, "we need you to come to the office." Bill looked up. The press hissed behind him, steam curling up into the air. He wiped his hands on a rag, hung it neatly on its hook, and followed. The walk to the office felt longer than it ever had before. Every sound seemed amplified, the buzz of lights, the squeak of boots on concrete, the clatter of tools being set down. Somewhere someone coughed, somewhere else someone whispered. In the glass room the manager waited, the same one from before, his tie perfectly straight, his smile perfectly hollow. "Mr. Turner," he began, voice measured, "we're here to discuss the incident involving your violation of company policy." Bill stayed standing. "What incident?" The manager gestured to a folder. "It's been brought to our attention that you've continued to encourage insubordination among your colleagues, sharing confidential information, disrupting workflow." Bill felt a rush of heat in his neck. "That's not true." The HR woman adjusted her glasses. "We have written statements." He didn't ask from whom, he already knew. The manager folded his hands. "We appreciate your many years of service, Mr. Turner, but after careful review, the company has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." There it was, said so calmly it almost didn't sound real. Bill blinked once, then twice. "You're firing me for speaking." "For misconduct," the manager replied. "You'll receive 2 weeks severance. You'll need to return your badge and clear your locker today." His throat tightened, but he refused to let it show. He reached into his pocket, took out his badge, and placed it on the desk. The plastic rectangle made a small, hollow sound when it landed, the sound of something ending. The manager stood, extending his hand. "We wish you the best, Mr. Turner." Bill looked at that hand, smooth, manicured, uncalloused, and didn't take it. He turned, walked out, and closed the door softly behind him. They made him leave through the side exit. It was procedure, they said, for security reasons. He passed the line of lockers where he'd spent half his life, the smell of detergent and metal lingering in the air. His lunchbox sat on the bench, waiting, the same dented blue one he'd carried since his first week on the job. He picked it up, feeling its weight. The thermos inside clinked softly. He thought of Marlene packing it that morning, humming to herself, unaware that by noon everything would change. Outside, the wind cut through his jacket. The sky had darkened, a slow curtain of gray pulling over the day. He crossed the lot alone, his boots crunching over old salt and grit. The guard followed a few paces behind, hands tucked in his belt, pretending not to look at him. When Bill reached his truck, he paused and turned back. Through the tall factory windows, he could see shadows moving, machines churning, life continuing without him, the same as always. He opened the door, set the lunchbox on the passenger seat, and sat there for a long time. His hands were trembling now, not from fear but from disbelief. 27 years gone in less than 7 minutes. When he pulled into the driveway, his son's car was already there. Jacob had stopped by unannounced, his old football jacket still too small for his shoulders. Smell of chili filled the house. Marlene must have started lunch early. Bill stepped inside quietly, trying to fix his face before they saw him. Jacob was setting the table. "Hey, Dad," he said with a grin. "Didn't expect you home already." Bill forced a smile. "Early day." Marlene turned from the stove, wiping her hands. "Everything okay?" He hesitated. The silence stretched. The ticking clock filled it. "They let me go," he said finally. Jacob froze, spoon in hand. "What? Why?" "Policy violation," Bill said, voice flat. "That's what they called it." Marlene stepped closer, her eyes wide with disbelief. "After all the years you gave them." He nodded, staring at the floor. "Years don't count the way they used to." For a moment no one spoke. The house felt smaller, the air thicker. The only sound was the slow simmer of chili on the stove. Then Jacob said softly, "You gonna fight it?" Bill looked up. There was something in his son's eyes, not pity but expectation. The kind of faith you don't ask for, but once it's given you can't let it down. He took a breath. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think I am." Marlene reached for his hand. Her fingers were warm, steady. Jacob nodded once, silent approval passing between them. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The factory siren sounded faintly in the distance, the same one he'd heard for decades, marking shifts he no longer belonged to. But for the first time, it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a beginning. That night the house seemed too quiet. Even the refrigerator's hum felt like it was holding its breath. Bill Turner sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed. The clock above the sink ticked softly, each second landing like a drop of water in an empty well. Outside, the wind pushed against the window panes, carrying the faint smell of rain and the whistle of far-off trains. He had a piece of company stationery in front of him, one of the few he'd kept in a drawer for years, back when he still thought of the factory as something permanent, something worth belonging to. The paper was yellowed at the edges, faintly wrinkled. Beside it sat his old fountain pen, the one Marlene had given him when he was promoted to shift lead 15 years ago. He uncapped it slowly. The ink flowed smooth, dark, steady. He wrote at the top, "To whom it may concern," then paused. He hated that phrase. How empty it sounded, how polite it tried to be about anger. He scratched it out, started again. "To the people who forgot what loyalty means." The words came slowly at first, uncertain, like a man learning to speak again after years of silence. Then they began to pour out, one sentence at a time, raw and unpolished. He wrote about the years, about how he'd watched that factory change hands and change hearts, about the men who'd grown old under those lights, their backs bending to keep the machines running while promises bent the other way. He wrote about the first time he'd been proud to clock in, how his father had shaken his hand, told him, "You'll never go hungry if you give an honest day's work," and how wrong that turned out to be. The ink bled slightly where his hand trembled. He wiped it away and kept writing. He described the laughter, that cruel, hollow sound from the day they mocked him in the break room. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. Everyone who mattered would recognize themselves between the lines. He wrote about Tom not as a traitor but as a man cornered by fear. He tried to be fair even when it hurt. "I can forgive a weak man," he wrote, "but I can't forgive a system that makes weakness the only way to survive." Hours slipped by unnoticed. The lamp cast a small, golden circle on the table. Everything beyond it felt like another world, dark, hushed, suspended. Rain began to fall, steady and thin, tapping against the window like quiet applause for something no one would ever see. When his hand cramped, he set the pen down and flexed his fingers. They were swollen from years of work, calloused in all the wrong places. He stared at them for a moment. These hands had built everything: roofs, fences, a home, a life. Now they were writing their first act of defiance. He picked the pen back up. He wrote about fairness not as an ideal, but as something tangible, something that used to live between people before greed took its place. He wrote about how silence had never protected anyone and how decency without courage was just decoration. Then he wrote a line that stopped him cold. "If you strip a man of his work, you don't just take his paycheck. You take his dignity and the quiet belief that he still matters." He set the pen down again, breathing shallowly. It was the truest thing he'd written. By the time the clock struck 2, the letter was 6 pages long. The words looked strange under the lamplight, messy, uneven, human. He read them once all the way through. Every sentence felt like a pulse, every paragraph like a small exhale after holding his breath too long. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. He reached for an envelope, folded the pages carefully, slid them inside, and sealed it shut. Then he just stared at it. It sat there on the table, small, ordinary, weightless, and yet it carried more of him than anything he'd ever built. He imagined dropping it in the mail. He imagined the manager opening it, frowning, passing it along to HR, who'd file it away under former employees' complaints. It would end up in a drawer somewhere, gathering dust beside policies and performance charts. He imagined, too, that maybe someone, a young worker, an intern, might one day find it and read it. Might feel something, might understand. For a long while he thought he'd send it anyway, just to make sure his voice existed somewhere outside his own head. But then he looked toward the hallway where the light from the living room stretched thin under the door to Jacob's room. He thought of his son, young, restless, still building a life in a world that rewarded silence more than truth. He didn't want that boy to inherit bitterness. He wanted him to inherit strength. Bill reached for the envelope, held it in both hands, and ran his thumb along the sealed edge. The paper was warm now, almost alive from his touch. He sighed, not in defeat but in understanding. Some letters aren't meant to be sent. Some are meant to remind you who you are. He opened the drawer beside him and placed the envelope inside, next to the warning letter from the company. 2 pieces of paper, one written by them, one written by him. 2 sides of the same story. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. He closed the drawer gently. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper, the kind of whisper that sounds like forgiveness. Bill leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy, the faint ache in his chest easing for the first time in days. The letter sat unseen in the dark, unsent, unread, but not unfinished. Because sometimes a man doesn't need to be heard by the world. He just needs to hear himself, clearly, honestly. Finally, the rain had stopped sometime before dawn. By the time Bill Turner stepped onto the porch, the sky was rinsed clean, a pale blue sheet stretching over the quiet neighborhood. The air smelled of wet cedar and coffee. Marlene was still asleep inside, her soft breathing the only sound from the house. He sat on the porch steps, holding his mug with both hands, watching the street awaken. The mail truck passed, tires whispering over puddles. A dog barked 2 houses down. It was the kind of morning that tried to pretend the world hadn't changed, even when it had. Bill hadn't touched the letter since that night. It sat folded in the drawer next to the warning notice, waiting for a reason to exist. But reasons like courage don't always come when you expect them. He thought he was alone until he heard footsteps approaching the gate. A woman's voice called out, light but confident, "Mr. Turner." He turned. A stranger stood by the fence, late 20s, maybe 30, with a notebook clutched to her chest and rain still glinting in her hair. She smiled in that careful way people do when they're asking for trust they haven't earned yet. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. "My name's Sarah Myers. I'm a reporter with the Herald-Ledger. I'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind." Bill blinked. "About what?" "About the factory," she said. "And what happened to you?" He didn't answer right away. He studied her, the nervous shift of her shoulders, the pen tapping lightly against her notebook. She didn't look like the kind of reporter who'd come to make trouble, more like the kind who still believed stories could fix something broken. "How'd you even find me?" he asked finally. She smiled, half embarrassed. "A friend of mine used to work at the plant. Word travels fast when a man stands up for himself." He looked away. "Is that what they're calling it?" "Some are calling it reckless," she said gently. "Some are calling it brave. I'd like to hear what you call it." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of wet soil. Bill hesitated, then nodded toward the porch. "You can sit." Inside, the house smelled of breakfast and wood polish. Marlene had woken up by then, surprised to see a stranger but too kind to show it. She poured coffee for both of them, then quietly disappeared down the hallway, leaving them in the warm light of the kitchen. Sarah opened her notebook. "You worked at Dalton Steel for 27 years, correct?" Bill nodded. "Since I was 26. And they fired you after you refused to sign the new policy. That's the story they'll print," he said, "but that's not the truth." She leaned forward slightly. "Then what is the truth?" Bill took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "The truth is, they stopped seeing us as people a long time ago. We were just numbers on a spreadsheet. They could take away a man's rights, his sick days, his pride, and call it efficiency." Her pen moved quickly across the page. "And you refused to stay silent." He gave a faint smile, something like that. She asked about the others, whether anyone stood with him, whether there were records, documents, anything that proved the company's actions. Bill hesitated, then opened the drawer beside the table. He pulled out the letter he'd written, the one he never sent, and placed it between them. "I wrote this a while back," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to show it to anyone, but it says what needs to be said." Sarah unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the first few lines. Her face softened as she read, the rhythm of her breathing slowing. "This is powerful," she murmured. "It's raw, honest. If you're willing, I could use parts of it in the story." Bill looked out the window. The sunlight had shifted, catching the small dust motes that danced in the air. He felt the weight of his own doubt pressing in. "You really think anyone would care?" he asked. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I think they already do. They just don't have the words for it yet." For the first time in weeks, he felt something stir inside, not hope exactly, but a spark of purpose. They talked for nearly 2 hours. She asked about working conditions, pay cuts, the families who'd been hurt. He told her names, dates, the way the policies crept in like weeds no one bothered to pull. At one point she paused her writing and said softly, "You know, my dad worked in a plant like yours. He never spoke up, but I think he always wanted to. Maybe that's why I'm here." Bill studied her, the sincerity in her voice cutting through his caution. "Your dad would be proud," he said simply. When she stood to leave, the sky had turned bright and clean. She closed her notebook and slipped it into her bag. "I'll make sure they hear your side, Mr. Turner," she said. "No spin, just the truth." He walked her to the gate. The air smelled faintly of cut grass, and somewhere in the distance a church bell rang, soft, deliberate, like a heartbeat. Sarah extended her hand. "Thank you for trusting me." He hesitated, then shook it. Her grip was firm but warm. As she walked away, her reflection flickered in the puddles along the road, the image of someone carrying a story heavier than her notebook could hold. When he went back inside, Marlene was sitting at the table, the half-empty coffee pot between them. "You told her?" she asked quietly. Bill nodded. "Yeah, I think it's time somebody did." Marlene reached across, touching his hand. "You did the right thing." He wasn't sure what right meant anymore. But as he looked toward the window where sunlight pooled across the floor, he felt a strange calm settle in his chest, the kind that comes when a truth finally finds its way out. The letter was gone from the drawer now, but it didn't feel lost. It was out there in someone else's hands, on its way to becoming something larger than paper. And for the first time in a long while, Bill Turner didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. For days after the journalist left, the house carried a quiet tension, the kind that hums just beneath peace, like a wire waiting to spark. Marlene noticed it first. Bill would wake early, drink his coffee standing, and stare at the yard as if he were listening for something only he could hear. At night he wrote notes, small, careful lines scrawled across envelopes, napkins, old grocery lists. Dates, times, names. She didn't ask what he was doing, she already knew. The article hadn't been published yet, but word had gotten out. Men from the factory called late at night, speaking in low voices that carried guilt, anger, or fear, sometimes all three. They wanted to know what he'd told the reporter. Some wanted to thank him, others wanted him to stop. "Bill," Marlene said one morning as he flipped through an old notebook, "you can't fight them alone." He looked up, eyes steady. "I'm not planning to, but if I'm gonna fight, I need the truth to stand on." The first person he visited was Eddie Mullins, an old friend who'd retired the year before the buyouts. Eddie lived in a small house by the edge of town, where the air smelled of pine and burnt wood from his stove. He greeted Bill with a tired grin. "Didn't expect to see you, Turner. Heard you finally told him where to stick it." Bill chuckled, "Something like that." They sat on the porch, passing a thermos of black coffee between them. The sun hung low, catching the frost that clung to the grass like shards of glass. "You still got those pay slips from the pension years?" Bill asked. Eddie frowned. "Why?" "I think they've been skimming overtime since before the merger. I just never had proof." Eddie disappeared inside, returning with a shoebox full of papers bound by rubber bands. "Never trusted them enough to throw these out." They spread the papers across the porch table, faded ink, yellow corners, the ghost of a promise broken long ago. Bill flipped through them carefully, scanning numbers, matching dates to memories. There it was, weeks of unpaid overtime hidden under adjustment codes. He exhaled, the breath leaving him like steam. "They've been doing it for years." Eddie leaned back, shaking his head, "and nobody ever said a damn word." Bill looked up. "We're saying it now." Next was Rita Gonzalez, one of the few women who'd worked the floor as long as he had. She lived in a small apartment above the hardware store, walls lined with photos of her kids in graduation gowns. When Bill explained why he'd come, she didn't hesitate. "You're not wrong," she said, opening a drawer filled with files. "I kept copies of the accident reports they never filed." She handed him a stack, the smell of paper and ink filling the room. The reports were stamped "internal use only," the kind of phrase that buried stories before they ever saw daylight. She tapped one page with her finger. "That's from when Frank broke his wrist on the line. They made him clock out before the ambulance came, said it was off-site injury." Bill stared at the line of ink, the bureaucracy trying to erase humanity. He nodded slowly. "Would you be willing to tell that to the reporter?" Rita met his gaze. "If it means my grandkids won't have to work for people like that." "Yeah, I will." Over the next week, Bill gathered more than he'd ever expected. Payroll slips, maintenance logs, copies of memos signed by supervisors who'd been promoted after accidents. Each page carried a story. Each story carried a man or woman who'd been too afraid to speak. He kept everything in a cardboard box under the bed. At night, when Marlene was asleep, he'd pull it out and sort through the evidence. He could smell the paper, dry, dusty, faintly chemical, like the scent of a room that hasn't been aired in years. It wasn't just proof, it was memory, and he handled it with the care of someone touching history. Sometimes, when the weight of it all grew too heavy, he'd close the box and sit there in the dark, hands clasped, trying to slow the pounding in his chest. Fear had a sound, a quiet, restless rhythm that never stopped once it began. But beneath the fear, something else was forming, conviction, steady as the earth beneath his feet. One evening, Sarah called. Her voice carried through the static like a pulse. "Bill," she said, "I've been looking through your letter again. I want to run a piece not just about you, but about the people behind you. The pattern, the proof. If we do this right, it could change things." He hesitated, glancing at the box near the bed. "Got more than you think." She paused. "Then let's show them." He could hear traffic behind her, car horns, the rhythm of city life, and for a moment he imagined the noise carrying his story out into a world that had stopped listening long ago. When he hung up, he sat in silence, the phone still warm in his hand. The room smelled faintly of rain again. Marlene appeared at the door, her robe pulled tight. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" Bill nodded. "If we don't, they'll keep pretending none of it ever happened." She crossed the room and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Then you'd better make sure you win." He smiled faintly. Winning's not the point anymore. What is? He looked toward the window where the moonlight cut a pale path across the floor, making it matter. That night he sealed the box with tape, labeled it with a single word in thick black marker, proof. Then he slid it under the chair near the front door, ready for when the time came. He could feel the house breathing with him, each creak and whisper of wind carrying a strange calm. For the first time since he'd lost his job, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of voices that had been waiting for someone to speak for them. And Bill Turner, quiet man, factory man, the one they laughed at, was ready to do exactly that. The morning it happened, Bill Turner didn't even own a smartphone. He had a flip phone, the kind that still clicked shut, and it never left the kitchen counter except to call Marlene or check the time. But that day the world found him anyway. It started with Sarah. She'd promised to send him the article before it went live. Just a draft, she'd said. He'd opened the printed copy she mailed him a few days later. 6 pages of clean, tight sentences. His name printed right there at the top. The man who wouldn't sign. He read it once, then again, slower. It wasn't angry, it wasn't bitter, it was true. When Sarah's story finally went online, she posted a short video clip, just 30 seconds of Bill sitting on his porch, sunlight on his shoulders, his voice steady but soft. "I gave them 27 years, he said. All I asked for was fairness." That single sentence became a spark. By noon, the clip had been shared 2,000 times. By evening, 200,000. Sarah called that night, her voice electric through the receiver. "Bill, it's everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, even the local news picked it up. People are calling you the voice of the working man." He didn't know what to say. He looked down at his old boots, then out the window where dusk had settled over the street in shades of amber and blue. "I didn't mean to be anybody's voice," he said quietly. "I just wanted mine back." The next morning the world felt louder. Reporters he'd never heard of started calling. A radio station from Chicago wanted an interview. Someone from a podcast asked if he'd speak about the modern labor movement. Marlene had to take the phone off the hook twice just so they could eat breakfast in peace. "You've turned into a celebrity, Bill Turner," she teased, half proud, half nervous. He smiled faintly, though a small unease tugged at him. It wasn't the attention that frightened him, it was what came next. He'd spent his whole life avoiding the spotlight, and now it had found him in his living room. He went outside to clear his head. The air was cold, crisp with the smell of wood smoke and morning dew. Across the street the neighbor waved from her porch. "Saw you on the news last night," she called. Bill waved back, unsure whether to feel flattered or exposed. By the end of the week, Sarah's story had been shared 1,000,000 times. It wasn't just about him anymore. Workers from other towns began commenting. Warehouse employees, nurses, truck drivers, people who'd lived their own versions of his story. One message read, "You said what I've wanted to say for years." Another, "We needed this, Mr. Turner, don't stop now." He read each one carefully, the words glowing faintly on the borrowed tablet Sarah had given him. Some messages made him smile. Others broke him a little. Late one night he came across a video. A young man in Michigan speaking to his phone camera, quoting Bill's words verbatim. "I gave them 27 years. All I asked for was fairness." The man's voice cracked at the end, his eyes wet. Bill turned the screen off, heart pounding. He sat there in the dark, the reflection of his own face faint in the glass, older, smaller, but somehow still carrying that young man's anger. Sarah called again the next morning. "Bill, you're trending. This thing's taken on a life of its own." He chuckled softly. "I don't even know what trending means." She laughed. "It means people are listening and some of them are scared." "What do you mean?" "I've gotten emails from company reps, PR departments trying to discredit you. They're saying you were fired for misconduct. They're digging." He let out a slow breath. Let him dig, all they'll find is calluses. Still, the weight of it pressed on him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, and that was both beautiful and terrifying. By Saturday the mailbox overflowed. Letters came from strangers, handwritten, folded carefully, sent from all over the country. A miner in West Virginia, a teacher in Oregon, a single mother in Texas. All of them thanking him, sharing their stories of layoffs, broken promises, dignity lost and found again. Marlene helped sort them on the dining table. The air smelled faintly of paper and ink and the faint salt of her tears. "They're writing to you," she said softly. "Not some symbol, you." Bill didn't know how to answer. He touched one envelope gently, tracing the shaky handwriting of an older man who'd written, "You reminded me that I mattered once." That evening, the local news van parked outside. A young anchor in a red coat knocked on his door, microphone ready. "Mr. Turner, we'd love a comment. How does it feel to have started a national conversation?" He hesitated. Marlene stood behind him, hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Then he stepped out into the fading light, the hum of the camera filling the silence. "I don't know about conversation," he said slowly, "but maybe people are just tired of being quiet." The anchor smiled, nodded, and the red light on the camera blinked once before going dark. When they left, Bill stood for a while on the porch. The street was still. The cicadas had begun their low song, a chorus of unseen persistence. He thought of all the hands that had built that factory, all the lives it had chewed through. And for the first time he realized this story, his story, no longer belonged to him. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been laughed at, ignored, or silenced. That night he turned the borrowed tablet on again. The video had surpassed 2 million views. Comments flooded in faster than he could read them. He clicked on one at random. A young woman had written, "My dad worked with you. He said you were the quiet one." Guess he was wrong. Bill smiled to himself. The quiet one, maybe once. He set the tablet down and looked out the window where the moon hung low and full above the town. The world outside was still the same, tired, imperfect, unkind. But something inside it had shifted. A small voice, once drowned by machines, had learned how to echo. It started quietly, the way storms often do. No thunder, no flash. Just a subtle shift in the air, the kind that makes your skin tighten before the wind ever rises. At first, Bill didn't notice it. He was too busy answering calls from strangers, too busy feeling for once that his voice had mattered. But the silence from Dalton Steel's side didn't last. It never does. On a gray Monday morning, Sarah called him. Her voice, usually quick and bright, carried a new heaviness. "They've launched a PR campaign," she said. "They're saying the story was misleading, that you violated safety protocols, that your termination was justified." Bill's jaw tightened. "They're lying." "I know," she said softly, "but they're good at it. They've hired a firm in Chicago, people whose job is to make the truth sound like an inconvenience." He didn't respond. He could hear papers shuffling on her end of the line, the sound of someone trying to outrun a narrative that was already spreading. "They've also started contacting your old co-workers," she continued. "Some of them are talking or being told to." "Tom," Bill said quietly. "They'll go to Tom first." He was right. 2 days later, Tom's face appeared in a local news clip online, nervous, eyes darting. He said the company had always been fair, that rumors of misconduct were overblown. He didn't name Bill directly, but he didn't have to. The segment ran under a headline that made Bill's stomach twist. "Former employee's story questioned as co-workers speak out." By nightfall, his phone buzzed with messages again, only this time they were different. Some supportive, some accusing, some filled with the kind of cruel certainty that only comes from people who never risked anything themselves. Marlene read a few before turning the phone face down on the table. "Don't," she said. "It's poison." But the words still seeped in, even through silence. Later that week, a white envelope appeared in their mailbox, no return address. Inside was a legal notice from Dalton Steel's attorneys, warning of defamatory actions and potential civil consequences. Marlene's hand shook as she read it. They wouldn't really." Bill took the letter from her gently, folded it once, and set it on the counter. "This is what they do," he said. "They don't fix what's broken, they scare people into silence." That night he couldn't sleep. The wind outside scraped branches against the window. The house creaked under its own weight. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tight. He wasn't afraid of losing money or reputation, there wasn't much of either left. What he feared was that people would stop believing him, that truth could be drowned in noise. By Friday, the backlash had grown teeth. Anonymous accounts on social media began sharing altered photos, his face beside misleading captions. "Disgruntled worker fabricates story for fame." Local talk radio hosts called him another martyr of self-pity. One even laughed on air. "If you spend 27 years somewhere and still get fired, maybe the problem is you." When Sarah called again, she sounded exhausted. "I'm fighting it, Bill. I'm correcting everything I can, but they're flooding the feeds with garbage faster than I can shovel it out." He could hear cars honking behind her, city life pressing on all sides. "You shouldn't have to fix this alone," he said. "I'm not," she replied. "Neither are you." But he wasn't so sure. Saturday afternoon brought another surprise. A man in a gray suit came to the door, polite, smiling, uninvited. "Mr. Turner," he said, offering a card. "I'm with Dalton Steel's Human Resources Division. Off the record, they'd like to reach a resolution." Bill didn't take the card. "Resolution," he repeated. "That what you call erasing people these days?" The man's smile flickered. "There's a confidentiality agreement on the table, substantial compensation. We can put this behind us and let them keep doing it to everyone else." The man adjusted his tie. "Sometimes, Mr. Turner, that's just the way the world works." Bill's voice dropped low, calm. "Then maybe it's time the world learned to work different." He closed the door before the man could answer. The card fluttered to the floor like a small white flag of surrender he refused to raise. That night, the TV in the living room played low. A news panel debated workplace loyalty and the dangers of viral outrage. Bill sat on the couch, hands clasped, listening as strangers dissected his life like a case study. Marlene came over, turned the TV off, and took his hand. "Don't let them take this from you," she said softly. "Not the truth, not your peace." He looked at her, eyes tired but steady. "They can twist my words, they can drag my name, but they can't change what happened." He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet street. Somewhere out there, people were still watching, still deciding who he was. But behind all the noise, he felt something stronger, the current of others waking up, recognizing themselves in his fight. For every lie, there was a voice whispering, "I know that feeling." For every smear, a stranger wrote, "Don't give up." He closed his eyes and let that thought anchor him. Outside, the wind picked up again, sharp, restless, alive. The kind of wind that doesn't destroy but clears the air before the next storm. And Bill Turner, standing in the dim light of his small house, knew the storm was far from over. But this time, he wasn't going to face it quietly. The courthouse smelled of dust and polished wood, old stories sealed into the grain of every bench, every railing. Bill Turner sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded, a legal pad in front of him, though he hadn't written a word. Across the room, 3 lawyers from Dalton Steel sat like a wall in matching suits, their silver pens aligned perfectly beside their files. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, cutting through the stale air in sharp, golden stripes. Outside, the town was alive, reporters waiting by the steps, cameras ready. But in here, everything felt smaller, contained, like truth itself had been boxed up, waiting to see if it was strong enough to breathe. Marlene sat a few rows back, her face calm but her hands clasped tight around a folded tissue. Sarah was beside her, notebook in her lap, ready but silent, for once just a witness. The bailiff called the court to order, his voice echoing off marble. When the judge entered, Bill stood, hat in hand, like a man who'd never stopped respecting rooms like this. The judge was an older woman with kind eyes and a sharp tone. "We're here for Turner versus Dalton Steel Incorporated," she said. "Mr. Turner, you're representing yourself with advisory counsel, correct?" Bill nodded. His lawyer, a local volunteer from a workers' advocacy group, sat beside him, young, eager, and nervous enough for both of them. The defense started first. Their lead attorney rose, tall, smooth-voiced, the kind of man who made lies sound elegant. He spoke of procedural misunderstandings, of company integrity, of policies applied without prejudice. He painted Bill as a disgruntled employee who refused to adapt to modern workplace standards. Every word landed like a small insult wrapped in politeness. Bill listened without flinching. His heartbeat was steady, though he could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him. When it was his turn, he stood slowly. The wooden chair creaked behind him. He walked to the center, his boots sounding heavier than they were. He didn't look at the defense. He looked at the judge. And then at the people sitting in the gallery, the local workers who'd shown up, the reporters scribbling, even a few old faces from the plant. "My name's Bill Turner," he began, voice low but clear. "I worked at Dalton Steel for 27 years. I didn't come here for money. I came here because somewhere along the line that company forgot it was made of people." He paused. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was alive, expectant. "I was fired because I refused to sign a policy that took away what we'd already earned, our sick days, our overtime, our dignity. They called it restructuring. I call it theft." He reached for a folder on the table and pulled out a handful of papers. "These are time sheets from the last 6 years," he said, walking them up to the bench. "Hours worked, overtime unpaid, adjustments that never got adjusted. You can see the handwriting, some of it mine." The defense lawyer objected, but the judge raised her hand. "Overruled. Proceed." Bill laid down another stack: accident reports, letters, and one photograph. A group of factory workers standing in front of the building years ago, smiling, unaware of the erosion that would come. He looked back at the gallery. "Some of these men are gone now. One of them broke his wrist on the job. The company called it an off-site injury so they wouldn't have to pay the medical bill. Another one lost his pension when the ownership changed hands. He never got to see a dime." He let the words sink in. "They tell you I broke the rules. Maybe I did. Maybe decency's against the rules now." His voice cracked slightly on the last line, but he didn't stop. "I don't want revenge. I just want them to say it out loud, that we mattered once, that all those hours, all that sweat wasn't just numbers in a ledger." When he finished, the room was still. Even the hum of the air vents seemed to pause. The judge leaned forward, studying him like she wasn't just hearing a case but weighing a lifetime. Then quietly, Sarah stood up from the gallery. "Your Honor," she said, holding up her press badge, "may I submit corroborating evidence from my investigation?" The defense objected again, sharp this time, but the judge nodded. "You may." Sarah walked up and placed a USB drive on the bench. It contains interviews, financial records, and internal emails from current employees, some of whom requested anonymity for fear of retaliation. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is this verified?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "Every word." The courtroom rustled, reporters scribbling faster, a murmur rippling through the crowd. The defense lawyer turned to whisper to his associates, his confidence faltering. Bill didn't move. He just stood there, hands clasped in front of him, the faintest tremor in his fingertips betraying the weight of the moment. Hours passed as the judge reviewed the materials. When she finally looked up, the air had changed. "Dalton Steel," she said, her tone measured, "will produce full payroll records within 10 business days for independent review. Additionally, this court will appoint a third-party auditor to investigate claims of withheld compensation and falsified injury reports." The defense team froze. One of them exhaled, a sound halfway between disbelief and defeat. The judge turned her gaze to Bill. "Mr. Turner, this isn't the end, but it's a beginning." He nodded once, unable to find words. As he stepped out of the courthouse, flashes from cameras painted the gray afternoon in bursts of white. Reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. Sarah caught up to him near the steps, breathless. "You did it, Bill." He shook his head, smiling faintly. "No, we did." Marlene reached for his hand as they descended the stairs together. The wind had picked up, cool and clean, carrying the sound of distant cheers from the crowd that had gathered outside the gates. For the first time, the factory in the distance didn't look like a place that owned him. It looked like something small enough to challenge. And as Bill Turner walked down those courthouse steps, the man who once stayed silent understood something simple and enormous. Truth, when spoken aloud, doesn't just set one person free. It shakes the walls that try to keep everyone quiet. The news spread faster than Bill could keep up with it. By the second morning after the hearing, his name was everywhere, whispered in coffee shops, scrawled on cardboard signs, echoed on late-night radio by hosts who said finally, someone stood up. He didn't recognize half the voices on the voicemails that filled his old flip phone. Men and women from towns he'd never seen, their accents rolling in like wind across the country. "God bless you, Mr. Turner. My daddy worked a plant just like yours. Don't stop now, we're with you." Marlene listened to a few of them while washing dishes, her face soft but unreadable. "He's become an idea," she murmured, half to herself. "And ideas don't go back in drawers." By the end of that week, people began showing up. They didn't come in crowds at first, just a trickle of neighbors and old coworkers, leaving notes on the porch or knocking shyly to say thank you. A man from the hardware store dropped off bottled water. A retired teacher from across town brought a stack of signatures. Each gesture felt like a spark, small but alive. Then on Sunday, Sarah called. "You should come downtown," she said. "You need to see this." When they arrived, Bill could hardly believe it. The courthouse lawn, the same place where he'd stood alone just days ago, was now filled with people. Hundreds of them, some holding homemade signs, others just standing shoulder to shoulder, their breath visible in the cool morning air. The banners read things like "Fair Work, Fair Pay, and We Stand with Bill Turner." At the center, a young woman was speaking into a megaphone. Her voice trembled not from fear but conviction. "My mom lost her pension at Dalton Steel's sister plant in Illinois," she said. "They told her to be grateful for a job, but jobs without justice aren't worth keeping." The crowd roared, clapping, stomping their feet. Bill stood near the edge, stunned. Marlene reached for his hand. "They're not just here for you," she whispered. "They're here for themselves." Sarah spotted him and motioned for him to step forward. The crowd noticed a ripple pass through them like wind through tall grass. People began to part, letting him through. The sound softened, not silence exactly, but anticipation. He climbed onto the small stage they'd built from old shipping pallets, the wood creaking under his boots. He looked out at the faces, young, old, worn, hopeful, and for a moment his throat closed. He'd spent a lifetime in rooms where nobody looked up when he spoke. Now hundreds waited for him to say something that mattered. "I don't know how to give speeches," he said finally, voice raw. "I'm just a man who got tired of seeing people treated like numbers." Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's why we're here." He nodded, taking a breath. "Told me one voice couldn't change anything. Maybe they were right, one voice can't. But when it's joined by 1,000 others that believe in something better, that's when things start to shake." The applause rose like thunder. Somewhere in the front, an old man wept quietly, clapping with trembling hands. Bill's eyes met his, and he recognized him, Eddie Mullins, holding a sign that read "Truth doesn't need permission." After the rally, they gathered at the diner down the street, a small, bustling place that smelled of bacon, grease, and coffee. The booths overflowed with laughter and talk, the sound of strangers becoming neighbors again. Rita Gonzalez sat beside Sarah, sliding a folder across the table. "These are more accident reports. The factory tried to bury them. I know because I wrote half of them." Sarah flipped through the pages, her brow furrowed. "This is enough to open a full federal inquiry." Bill watched them quietly. The noise of dishes, the scent of frying onions, the hum of life, it all felt surreal. He wasn't used to this kind of energy around him. He'd fought his fight in silence for so long, it felt strange to see it carried forward by others. Tom walked in near closing time. The room went still. Conversations paused mid-sentence. He stood at the door, hat in hand, eyes lowered. "Bill," he said softly, "can I talk to you a second?" The tension broke like thin ice. Bill nodded and followed him outside. They stood beneath the diner's neon sign, the air crisp and sharp. Tom's voice trembled. "I told them what they wanted to hear back then. They threatened to fire me too. I've regretted it every day since." Bill said nothing. Tom's eyes glistened. "I want to make it right. I've still got files from the plant, emails they told us to delete. I can give them to Sarah." Bill studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then do it." Tom let out a shaky breath. Relief and guilt tangled together. "You're a better man than me." Bill looked up at the glowing sign flickering above them. "No," he said quietly, "just a man who ran out of things to lose." The next morning, news stations reported a growing movement. Workers across 3 states demanding audits, petitions spreading online. Someone started a page called the Turner Movement. Within a week, it had 50,000 members. Reporters called it the rise of the working-class heartland. Politicians called it an inconvenience. Bill called it something simpler, people remembering they had a say. One evening, as he and Marlene sat on the porch, headlights rolled slowly down the street, cars honking, people waving from windows, holding signs out the sunroof. She leaned against his shoulder, smiling. "You see what you started." Bill shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't start it," he said. "I just stopped apologizing for wanting something fair." The sound of car horns faded into the night. The stars above looked closer than usual, steady and watchful. Somewhere out there, in houses and towns he'd never see, people were standing up, not because of him, but because he'd reminded them they could. And for the first time in his life, that felt like enough. It was late autumn when the letter arrived. A thick envelope embossed with Dalton Steel's insignia, sharp and metallic against the cream paper. Bill found it wedged between the electric bill and a flyer for discounted roofing repairs. He turned it over twice before opening it, his thumb tracing the company logo like it was an old scar. Marlene watched from the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a towel. "You don't have to read it," she said softly. He did anyway. Inside was a printed statement on official letterhead. Words arranged carefully by lawyers, polished until they lost all warmth. Dalton Steel deeply regrets the misunderstandings that have led to public concern. We acknowledge Mr. Turner's many years of service and apologize for any distress caused. He read it once, then again, slower, not because he doubted the words, but because he wanted to feel something from them. Anything. He didn't. The apology was clean, sanitized, like it had been scrubbed free of guilt before being mailed. He folded it neatly and placed it on the table. "Guess they're trying to close the book," he said. Marlene frowned. "You going to answer?" He shook his head. "No point writing back to a machine." The next morning the town was buzzing. The statement had gone public, printed in newspapers, replayed on local news, dissected online. Some called it an admission of guilt. Others said it was just damage control. Bill didn't say much about it. He spent the day helping his neighbor fix a broken fence, the smell of cut wood and damp earth grounding him more than any headline could. When he came home, Sarah was waiting on the porch, her notebook tucked under her arm. "You saw the letter?" she asked. "I saw it," he said. "Didn't change a thing." She nodded. "It's not the kind of apology that means forgiveness. It's the kind that means fear. They're losing control of the story." Bill leaned against the porch rail, the boards cool beneath his palms. The air carried that dry chill of early November, smoke from chimneys, distant leaves crackling under passing cars. He looked out toward the horizon, where the factory stacks cut a dark silhouette against the amber sky. "They're not scared of me," he said quietly. "They're scared of being seen." That evening, as dusk settled, another car pulled into the driveway, black, polished, quiet. A man stepped out, dressed too well for the gravel road. Bill recognized him instantly, the corporate representative who'd once offered him confidential compensation. The man smiled, tight and professional. "Mr. Turner, I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," Bill said plainly, "but go ahead." The man exhaled, glancing toward the porch light. "I just wanted to deliver this in person." He held out a smaller envelope, this one handwritten, from Mr. Hale, the regional director. Bill didn't move to take it. "What's in it?" "A personal letter," the man said. "An apology. He wanted you to know he admires your courage. He wishes things had gone differently." For a moment, Bill said nothing. The crickets outside had gone still, the night listening in. Then he stepped forward, took the envelope and opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in blue ink. The handwriting was neat but uncertain, as if each line had been rehearsed. "Bill," it began, "you were right. The policies were wrong. I signed them under pressure from corporate, and I've regretted it since. I know this letter can't undo what we did, but I want you to know I'm sorry." He read it twice, then looked up. "Tell Mr. Hale I appreciate the words," he said, "but this letter's not for me, it's for him." The man blinked. "I don't follow." Bill's voice was calm, almost kind. "He's not apologizing to me, he's trying to forgive himself. That's different." The man's polished composure faltered. "Then what should I tell him?" Bill folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "Tell him I already moved on." He turned, walked inside, and closed the door behind him. Later that night he sat in the living room with the letter in his lap. The fireplace crackled softly, the flames reflecting in his eyes. Marlene sat across from him, knitting, her rhythm steady and familiar. "You're quiet," she said after a while. He smiled faintly. "I was just thinking about all the years I waited for people to say sorry, bosses, supervisors, the system. And now that they finally did, it doesn't feel like I thought it would." She set the yarn down, watching him. "Because you don't need it anymore." He nodded slowly. "Guess that's what peace feels like." The fire popped, sending a brief shimmer of sparks up the chimney. He placed the letter on the mantel, beside an old photo of him and the factory crew, younger men, brighter smiles, all of them frozen in a time when they still believed the world was fair. He stood there for a long time, studying the picture. Then quietly he said, "Maybe this is what an apology should do. Remind us we never needed one to begin with." Marlene joined him at the mantel, slipping her hand into his. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft, slow, gentle. Through the window, the flakes drifted under the porch light, each one catching the glow for just a second before disappearing into the dark. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. It was something simpler, the calm that comes when a man finally realizes he's already whole. Bill reached up, took the letter from the mantel, and placed it in the drawer beside the others, the warning, the unsent letter, the proof. But this one felt different. It didn't weigh anything at all. It had been almost a year since Bill Turner last walked through the gates of Dalton Steel. The town had changed in small, quiet ways. The diner now had a new coat of paint, the grocery store a brighter sign. But the factory, sitting like a hulking shadow on the edge of town, looked exactly the same. Gray walls, high fences, the same smokestacks that had marked the skyline of his life. He hadn't planned to go back. Not really. But after the investigation wrapped, after the company was ordered to repay the stolen wages and reinstate health benefits, he got a letter. Not the cold, corporate kind this time. A real one. It was from the new plant manager, a woman named Evelyn Grant. She'd taken over after the board reshuffled. Her handwriting was steady, deliberate. "Mr. Turner, I believe it's time the factory met the man who helped rebuild its conscience. We're hosting a community reopening event. It would mean something if you came." He'd read it twice, folded it, and left it on the table for days. Marlene finally said, "If you don't go, it'll just sit in your head like a stone you keep tripping over." So that morning he went. The air outside was crisp, edged with the faint metallic tang he knew too well. The parking lot was full, not of cars belonging to suits from corporate, but workers in boots and jackets, families with children running between their legs. At the gate, someone recognized him. Bill Turner. A young man called out, his eyes wide. "You're him, right? The guy who started all this?" Bill smiled politely. "I didn't start anything," he said. "Just stop pretending nothing was wrong." Inside, banners hung from the rafters, "New Beginnings at Dalton Steel," and a small stage had been set up near the assembly floor. The smell of oil and warm machinery filled the space. He hadn't realized until then how much he'd missed it, not the noise or the grind, but the rhythm, the heartbeat of working hands. Evelyn met him near the front. She was younger than he'd imagined, sharp eyes, sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Turner," she said, extending a hand. "I've been waiting to meet you." "Just Bill," he replied, shaking it. Her grip was firm, honest. "I know what this place used to be," she said. "I know what they did to you, and to others. We're trying to make it right." He nodded, glancing around. "You can't fix what's gone," he said softly, "but you can build better from what's left." She smiled at that like she understood. When the speeches began, Bill stayed near the back. He didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted to see faces, old and new. He spotted Rita Gonzalez standing near one of the machines, her hard hat tucked under her arm. "Didn't think I'd ever step foot in here again," she said with a laugh. "But here I am, foreman now. Can you believe that?" He grinned. "I can. Should have happened 20 years ago." Across the room he saw Tom too. They hadn't spoken since the day outside the diner when Tom had turned over those incriminating files. Their eyes met for a brief second. Tom raised a hand, small and hesitant. Bill nodded back, not as forgiveness but as acknowledgement. It was enough. The hum of machines filled the air again, this time not with exhaustion but energy. The workers cheered as Evelyn announced new safety measures, better pay, union representation. For once, applause didn't sound forced, it sounded earned. Then unexpectedly she called his name. "Before we close," she said, "I think we all know who made today possible. Mr. Bill Turner, would you join us up here?" The crowd turned, parting like a tide. He froze. His instinct was to shake his head, stay quiet. But Marlene's voice echoed in his mind, "If you don't go, it'll just sit in your head like a stone." So he walked forward. The stage lights were harsh, washing out color. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, the low hum of murmurs as he reached the microphone. He cleared his throat. "I never wanted any of this," he said simply. "Not the attention, not the noise. I just wanted to be treated fair." He looked down at his hands, callous still, though softer now. "I worked this line for almost 3 decades. My father before me. We gave it everything we had because we believed it meant something. Somewhere along the way they forgot that." He paused, the silence heavy and full. "But here's the thing about forgetting, people remember, eventually, and when they do they stand up." A ripple of applause began, spreading through the room. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Don't clap for me, clap for yourselves. You're the reason this place is breathing again." The applause grew anyway. It rolled through the factory like thunder, echoing off the steel beams and concrete floors, carrying with it something he hadn't heard in years, hope that sounded like pride. Afterward, as people began to leave, he walked the factory floor alone. He ran his fingers along the cold metal of the machines, remembering the rhythm, the repetition, the way time used to disappear between shifts. Evelyn approached quietly. "You okay?" "Yeah," he said, eyes fixed on the distant lights. "Feels strange, like visiting an old ghost that learned how to live again." She smiled. "We couldn't have done this without you." He looked at her. "Then don't let it become what it was. Promise me that." "I do," she said. He nodded, tipping his cap slightly, then started toward the exit. Outside, the evening light had turned soft and gold. The smokestacks rose above him, no longer symbols of oppression but reminders, tall, steady, scarred, still standing. He turned once, taking in the sight, the workers laughing, the clang of tools, the hum of rebuilding. Then he smiled to himself and walked to his truck. The sound of life behind him, blending with the quiet of a man finally at peace with where he'd been. The sun was setting low over the town, that late evening kind of light that makes everything look softer, like the world itself is catching its breath. From his porch, Bill Turner could see the factory in the distance. It no longer loomed the way it used to. The gray of its walls had turned silver in the sunset, and the smokestacks stood like quiet monuments, not to power or profit but to endurance. He sat there in his old chair, the one that creaked every time he leaned back, with a cup of coffee cooling slowly between his palms. Marlene was in the kitchen humming to herself, the smell of cornbread drifting through the open window. It was a normal evening, beautifully, perfectly normal. For a man who'd spent years fighting to be heard, there was something holy in ordinary peace. In the months since the factory reopened, things had changed, not just there but everywhere. Dalton Steel had become a symbol, a headline that refused to fade. Workers across the country used it as proof that fairness wasn't nostalgia, that decency wasn't a weakness. The Turner movement grew, not because of speeches or rallies, but because people were finally learning to listen to one another again. And for Bill, the noise eventually quieted down. The reporters stopped calling. The interviews stopped coming. And life, real life, returned. He started fixing things again. Leaky faucets for neighbors, old engines, fences that had gone crooked. He liked the rhythm of it, the sound of tools, the smell of oil and cedar. It reminded him that creation and repair were cousins, both ways of saying I still care about the world. One Friday evening, Marlene told him they'd been invited to the factory's first employee appreciation dinner. He chuckled. Didn't think they'd ever put appreciation and employee in the same sentence. She smiled, tugging at his sleeve. "Then maybe that's exactly why we should go." So they did. The event was held in what used to be the main assembly hall, the place where he'd spent half his life. But it looked different now. The machines had been pushed to the walls, replaced by long wooden tables lined with candles and food. There was music, soft, live, a local band playing old American folk tunes that somehow fit perfectly with the sound of laughter and clinking plates. And right there, near the center of the room, was a plaque mounted on the wall. It read, "The Table of Respect, dedicated to those who stood for fairness when it wasn't easy to stand at all." Below the inscription, in small letters, were a few names, including his. He stopped in front of it, reading quietly. Marlene touched his arm, her eyes glistening. "They remembered," she whispered. He nodded. "Yeah, guess they did." Dinner was warm, loud, human. People told stories between bites of casserole and pie. Rita raised a toast to the men and women who turned noise into change. Tom stood and apologized publicly, not for the past, but for staying silent too long. And Evelyn, the new plant manager, spoke last. She stood at the head of the hall, her voice steady and sincere. "This factory doesn't just build steel anymore," she said. "It builds respect. We learned that from a man who didn't shout but still made the world listen." The crowd turned toward Bill. He shifted awkwardly in his chair, cheeks flushed. "Now don't start that," he said, half smiling. "I've had enough attention to last me another 27 years. The laughter came easy, real. Later, after dessert, the workers began clearing tables together, no orders, no hierarchy, just people helping people. Bill joined them, stacking plates, folding napkins. Across the room, he saw Sarah Myers leaning against the wall, notebook in hand, smiling at the scene. She walked over and said softly, "You know, I never wrote the follow-up story." He looked up. "Why's that?" "Because I realized it didn't need one," she said. "Some stories don't end with headlines. They end like this, quietly but right." He nodded. "Quiet's not so bad." She smiled. "No, Mr. Turner, it's not. When the night ended, everyone gathered for one final moment at the table of respect. Someone started a slow clap. Others joined. It wasn't loud or grand, it was something better, steady, grateful, alive. Bill didn't make a speech. He just stood there, hand resting on the edge of that wooden table, the grain smooth beneath his fingers. He thought of all the men and women who'd stood beside him, those who hadn't lived to see this day, those who still worked unseen across the country. He whispered almost to himself, "This wasn't just for me, it was for all of us." That night back home, he and Marlene sat at their own kitchen table, smaller, older, but carrying the same kind of respect. Lamplight pooled gently across the wood, touching the faded coffee rings, the scratches from years of dinners, Bill's laughter and tears. Marlene poured him a cup of tea. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The factory, the fight?" He thought for a moment. "No," he said finally. "I don't miss the fight, but I do miss what it made people remember, that work only means something if we see each other while we're doing it." She smiled softly. "Then maybe that's the real legacy." He went quiet then, listening to the sound of the clock ticking, steady, patient, forgiving. He thought about the long road that had brought him here, the laughter in the break room, the warning letter, the fear, the courtroom, the movement, the faces that stood with him and the ones that turned away. He thought of his father's voice, that simple wisdom from so many years ago. "You'll never go hungry if you give an honest day's work." And he realized now, it was never really about hunger. It was about worth, about knowing that what you give to the world still counts, even when the world forgets to say thank you. He leaned back in his chair, watching the lamplight flicker. For the first time in a long time, there was no anger, no ache, only a quiet fullness. He'd lost his job but gained something bigger, a voice that became a bridge, a table that became a symbol, and a truth that outlived every machine he'd ever worked beside. Respect isn't given by title or paycheck. It's built day by day by how we treat one another when no one's watching. For everyone listening now, Bill Turner's story isn't just about a man or a factory. It's about us, about every time we've stayed silent when we should have spoken, or doubted our worth because the world told us we didn't matter. It's a reminder that courage doesn't always look like shouting or fighting. Sometimes it looks like showing up. Sometimes it's just saying, "This isn't right," even when your voice shakes. And sometimes it's standing by your table at work, at home, in life, and demanding that respect be part of what's served. Because respect is the foundation of every relationship, every workplace, every family that survives. It's what lets us look at each other and still believe in better. So maybe tonight, after hearing this story, you'll sit at your own table with your family, your friends, or maybe just by yourself, and think about what respect really means to you. Maybe you'll remember Bill Turner not as a hero, but as proof that even one honest voice can start a change that no storm can silence. Thank you for spending your time with this story, for listening, for feeling, for believing that decency still matters. If this story touched you, share it. Subscribe to the channel so more people can hear voices like Bill's, the quiet kind that remind us what strength really sounds like. Until next time, take care of yourself, cherish your loved ones, and may your home always be filled with warmth, understanding, and the kind of respect that never needs to be written on a plaque to be real.